Well, this was quite a weekend in Jets hockey. It's going to leave some of you very happy, some of you probably pissed off. We'll dive into all of it on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. As always, we appreciate your love and support and want to keep you updated on the latest and greatest in Winnipeg Jets news and analysis. Tonight's episode, like I said, we are diving into a lot from the past couple of days. There's been an update on the Rutger McGroarty case. Obviously, there's been Nikolai Ehlers trade rumors, and of course, all of Winnipeg's draft picks, which they just went through. And, you know, I think it's pretty interesting how the Jets approached this year's draft. I would say that there's some similarities to last year's or some previous year's drafts, and who they got out of it, I would say it's pretty fair, right? There's a couple of players that I think were drafted well below where they should have been, and a couple of guys who, or maybe one or two guys where I'm kind of like a little bit questioning, right? But overall, you know, I think the Jets did reasonably well enough, and we'll talk about a couple of those guys in just a moment. But obviously, let's kind of dive into the first big pick and really get excited about Alphonse Frey at 37th overall. Frey comes from the Bio Lakers, and I think, from watching his footage, and it's not like I've done like a super deep dive, don't get me wrong, but from some of the footage and scouting reports I've been able to pull up, what strikes me about Frey is that he kind of reminds me a little bit of Josh Morrissey. Obviously, the Jets have a very big deficiency in puck-moving ability, especially on the blue line, and it's something that we've talked about repeatedly, and Frey looks like a very explosive, very fun, very active and confident blue liner, a kid who's going to be very aggressive below the goal line. He loves to hug along the half wall and then dive towards the goal line. Sometimes he'll operate from behind the net, and he's also capable of doing these kind of cross-seam skating routes where he'll actually finish good scoring opportunities similar to a winger, and he's also very happy to hit some nice cutback passes, very just active and offensively engaged, which when you're a team like Winnipeg, you really could, use a lot of that. In terms of like the way that he thinks about attacking space, I think he's very smart. Some of his tool sets, I think, are where you start to see a few limitations, and it's why he wasn't like a top 10 pick necessarily, but a guy who in a lot of rankings and for some scouts that I tend to trust a lot, he was pretty highly regarded. The thing with his particular tool sets is that he is a little raw. You'll notice it in his skating. His first step and acceleration are a little bit sluggish, and sometimes I think his timing on when he tries to pivot, say on the back check or something, it's a little slow, but it's something that's very fixable. I think, when you see the way that he maybe defends his own blue line for a rush opportunity, you'll kind of notice he does a little bit of the Pionk thing where he kind of turns a little bit late, and sometimes it gets him into some trouble. But overall, I think that there's a lot to work with. I think the active and engaged part of his offensive game is something that the Jets really could use. There's some really nice passing ability. He's got a pretty nice release. And in terms of a guy who most closely emulates the way that Morrissey maybe attacks space and stuff, not at the same level. Don't get me wrong. He's not like an elite top pairing guy. It would take a lot for that to go right. But I think in terms of the way that he thinks about the game, at least, there's some really interesting stuff there. He's a very modern defender. I think he's going to be supremely fun and offensively gifted. Obviously, a lot of you are going to look at his size and say that that's going to be a problem. I think the thing with the Jets is that in terms of big players, they don't really need lots of size on the back end. I mean, they already have some guys who are pretty beefy, and I think what really lacks is guys who can actually move the puck. if a skater is big and strong and is capable of advancing the puck up the ice, I really don't mind. I think that's great. If there's a strong, big physical player who's also good in transition, has capable distribution ability, and also has a half decent shot, I think that's the most important thing. You want to have a marriage of size and skill. And a lot of the bigger players don't always have that. And it's why I think size should be a little bit further down the list when you're looking for guys who can really help make your team faster. I think that's the biggest thing, is that the Jets need to go faster. And Frey is somebody who very much thinks the game at a fast level. Skating, still a work in progress, but once he's in the offensive zone, it seems like he's very active. It seems like he thinks the game pretty quickly. It's just getting his body to match up to that. But again, he's pretty young. I think he's a very exciting prospect. And given where the Jets got him at 37th overall, that feels like a really great value pick. I think he's going to be a great prospect. All of the underlying stats reports for him from Sweden are just glowing. It seems like a lot of scouts who do a lot of data science work tend to really, really like his sheer level of offensive production. So I think the Jets did really, really well here. Now, one pick that I would say, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order because I want to talk about our sleeper picks, but one pick that kind of seems a little bit interesting and perhaps a little bit off is Markus Loponen. Loponen was drafted at 155th overall, and the thing with Loponen is that he's a little bit hard to read. There's not a ton of footage out there of him. The footage that I saw, he's definitely a work in progress. He has played in some international tournaments for like Finland's U20 and U18 teams, and I don't know. I see why he tends to score a lot. He kind of does that line A lean on his release, where he can get a lot of torque from an off-balance position, and he does have a strong shot. But I feel like in terms of his engagement along the boards and where he is in the offensive zone, one thing that kind of stuck out to me is that he's a little bit late to his reads. It just seems like when the puck was in the area, he was either a step behind or just didn't time it quite right. And that can be a harder thing for players to really work on. Loponen obviously was drafted in the 5th round, so he's a bit of a shot in the dark. Again, from some of the scouting reports, it seems like a lot of folks have very mixed reviews on him. There's some folks who like his strength and physicality. There are some folks who really like his release. And there are some others who just think that, offensively, there's something in his game that's a bit of a disconnect. He shoots well and he's got some soft hands, but in terms of how he gets to those positions and makes use of it, that's where there's perhaps a little bit more of a disconnect. So in terms of like a guy that you take a bit of a dart throw on, it's fine. I feel like this year, the draft was a little all over the place in terms of some guys who really fell way too far. I think Misa is one of the clearest examples of a guy who arguably should have been in the top half of the 1st round and somehow fell to 150th overall. Great on the Flames. But for the Jets, I think a pick like this is not the worst, but I've seen some other names like Nieminen and a few others that folks have mentioned that were quite frankly better value picks. So, I mean, it is what it is. Like, I'm just curious, obviously the Jets scouts have had some interesting profiles that they've gone after, and Loponen, doesn't really check one that's all that familiar. He does play center, but I think the predominant footage that I've seen of him is that he's more of a winger. And when you see how he works along the half walls and stuff, I don't know. It's interesting. He was praised by Mark Hillier as being a two-way center, which I don't know that I necessarily see. I'll have to kind of reserve judgment until we get more footage of him. I feel like there's not a lot out that's publicly available. There's definitely footage of his shifts with Instat, which I don't pay for. Some scouts out there do. But yeah, interesting one, right? But of the picks, I would say he was probably the so-called weakest, but obviously if the Jet scouts like him, it'll be interesting. Our Finnish picks recently, I feel like I've been a little bit mixed on. Like Nikkanen hasn't quite taken off the way that I thought he was going to. Obviously, Vesalainen has been a bit of a disappointment. And, Heinola, I would say, is probably the one that has the best chance of really being an impact player for us. But, it's a question of him just staying healthy this year and if he can get that spot, because I think he's clearly lined up for an NHL role, and maybe Loponen at some point becomes something. We'll just have to be patient with him. But I would say if that's your worst pick of the draft, you probably had a pretty solid round of picks. And I want to talk about a couple of guys the Jets picked up that I think are very intriguing and potentially ones to mark on your future watch here as we start getting into, well, what really is kind of building out the future of Winnipeg's core. We'll dive into those potential sleeper picks and some guys that you should really be paying attention to in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, I just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Just like building a top-end NHL roster, you've also got to build a top-end vehicle with some great parts. And they've got everything from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, all to help you whether you're looking for speed, power, or style, maybe everything. eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just going through recent updates with the Jets, some draft stuff. Obviously, the Rutger McGroarty saga continues to move on, but let's focus on Winnipeg's immediate future because the Jets have drafted some intriguing prospects this year. Obviously, there's been some debate as to what exactly they're going to be at the NHL level, but in terms of potential, there's definitely some very interesting upside with most of the guys that they've picked up. Before we dive into a couple of other picks that are worth shouting out, just wanted to let you know, for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, for this year's Jets draft, Winnipeg obviously didn't have like a ton of high-level picks. Winnipeg ended up making 4 selections, and I talked about the first one in Alphonse Frey, and then I talked about our 5th-round pick, Markus Loponen, just because the other 2 that they got, I'm a little interested in, and I wanted to spend a little more time talking about both of them. So the first one came out of round number 4, pick 109, and I'm sorry, I'm going out of order. I know it's going to irritate some people, but Kevin He from the Niagara Ice Dogs is a very interesting player. Winnipeg actually traded up to get He, which I thought was a little surprising. There were some other pretty decent names, again, like Luke Misa, obviously would have been an interesting one. But in terms of He, when you think about what the Jets brought Shibrikov in to do, I think he kind of ticks off some similar sort of some boxes, right? Kevin is a very fast skater. I think that's the first thing that's going to stick out is that in terms of like his north-south speed, the dude just seems to blow by defenders. And what's also interesting about him is that he actually, despite being like 5'11", seems to really outmuscle his opponents. I've seen, from some of his highlights and footage where he'll get a breakaway by essentially screaming up the middle, and you'll have the 2 defenders try and pivot to stop him, and they'll both get their arms and stick in this way, but he actually just sort of shields them off, which for a guy his size, you wouldn't typically associate with being like super strong to sort of just outmuscle guys. But once he gets that inside step, he's kind of gone. It's a very valuable skill for Winnipeg because the Jets are traditionally just a slow team. We've seen that the Jets skaters don't tend to be all that quick, whether it's lateral or vertical skating. And that's where he, I think, has some really interesting traits. Obviously, the skating is only one part of his game. You also match it with a very deceptive release. One thing that I noticed from his highlights is that he seems to get the release off very quickly. I don't think it's like an overwhelmingly powerful shot in the way that you see with guys like Line and a few others, but in terms of a very fast, deceptive release that sort of explodes off his stick, I've seen him score from pretty sharp angles, from some great distances, and his shot just seems to fool goalies on a pretty routine basis. He is a very fun player, and he's often described as having like a really elite motor, which I think for Winnipeg is, again, not that dissimilar to Shibrikov. He had a pretty big season last year. Obviously, overall his career scoring is like 87 points in 130 games. And, as a young guy, he's going to continue to get better and better. I think he's a very interesting prospect. I think some people are going to suggest that maybe he was a little bit overdrafted just because there were some other selections that could have been really good value picks for where he was taken. But in terms of a guy that I think is going to be an NHLer, I do think Kevin will have at least a middle six role, right? Maybe a bottom six if things kind of stagnate for him a little bit. But I feel like in the first couple of years, he's done pretty well with Niagara. I see him being, a very fun player. He'll be a wide guy who I think can, get past defenders pretty easily. And I think it solves, long-term, one of the big complaints that we always have with the Jets in that they just don't draft fast skaters, and he'll be perhaps one of those really explosive guys who can kind of move, from 0 to 100 in almost, no time flat. So very interested in his profile. Happy to see he's also, the highest drafted Chinese-born player ever, which is awesome. As a fellow Asian, for me, that's just very cool. You don't really see moments like that. He moved to Ontario when he was like 5, so he spent most of his time in Canada. But, again, it's pretty cool. You don't really see as many Asian-born players making the jump over to North America for hockey. And so it's cool that, we have a cool young prospect with a great story and a guy who brings a lot to the table in terms of some very useful skill sets and tool sets that I'm hoping Winnipeg can really hone. And, of course, all the he is him memes have been just flying left and right. He already seems like he's going to be a really fun player, and I hope that he sticks around and is able to really land an NHL role. That's the same that I always say for everyone, but, it's just cool when you have like a really unique story, kind of like Nate Smith did when he first was trying to make the Jets. I guess he didn't end up making the Jets. He ended up going out to Arizona, but he started from a really late age in roller hockey, which is a very different approach, but, some similar skill sets and stuff, and made the transition over to ice hockey. So, you always kind of root for these unique stories and some stuff that you don't often see. But the last player the Jets picked, and perhaps the one that's like a really intriguing long-term ad, it's Kieron Walton. And Walton has actually been, by a lot of scouts, implied to be a real sleeper pick. A lot of folks were thinking he might get drafted as high as the 3rd or 4th round, which, considering the Jets got him in the 6th at pick 187, is fascinating. He's a 6'6" center, and the first thing that you'll notice is that he has a great shot. Like, his release is tremendously powerful. I think he's got one of the strongest shots of anyone the Jets drafted this year, and in his time with Sudbury, he did start off a little bit on the slower side, and I think that's still something that folks are kind of working on with him, but his mobility tends to be pretty high. He's a good skater, and what's really impressive is that he has incredible stick handling in really tight spaces. Walton really seems like a really intriguing guy, as maybe like a Tage Thompson-y sort of player, very tall, very strong, but with very good and tight puck control, which Thompson, of course, had a bit of an injury-riddled season this past year, but Walton, I feel like, is really intriguing. And it's also funny because I just had his bio up and I wasn't really reading it too closely, but Tage Thompson is actually his favorite player, which makes a lot of sense when you watch the way that he kind of dives down the middle. When he was engaging defenders, I think one of the things that immediately stood out was how comfortable he was, essentially, threading a needle, driving between defenders, basically deking around them and between them. And he just exhibits really smooth control and a great shot with some great spatial awareness. His passing is also really good. And I think if you start to speed his game up to a pro level, he has a lot of intriguing tool sets that you just don't see with many players. I kind of think of him maybe as like this year's Jacob Julian. I think that there is a lot of potential for him to continue to grow his game, and maybe he only tops out as like a third liner, but if you get a third liner in the 6th round with his particular tool sets, you are just hitting a home run of a pick. He can also play technically as a winger, but I think, it's going to be best when he's down the middle. Obviously you'll look at his early Sudbury numbers and think it doesn't seem that impressive, but you also have to remember he basically just turned 18 in like late April. So I'm very intrigued by this pick. I think this is one of those that could age really well for the Jets. In terms of like a big man that I was saying earlier that's skilled and has mobility, this is exactly what I think I was asking for. So I'm fascinated. I'm very interested, and I'm hoping that he is able to really evolve over the next 3 to 4 years. I think that there is a very intriguing player here, and one that you should kind of put on the docket for Winnipeg's long term. I've seen some discussions from 1 or 2 scouts that he does potentially have top 6 upside. So I don't want to oversell him. Obviously, he is still a bit of a long shot, as most prospects are, but he was ranked pretty highly by a number of folks, relatively speaking, compared to where he was actually picked. So let's just say Winnipeg actually had a pretty solid draft. And I think they kind of needed to, because the weekend of news wasn't exactly great for the Jets. We're going to talk about the Rutger McGroarty saga and what has continued to be a bit of a headache for Winnipeg in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. I love sports, and I love them so much that I never want them to end. But as the playoffs wind down, of course, the NHL playoffs are over, basketball's finished. You start to realize that there's not a lot to fill the void. Thankfully, this year we've got the Euros if you enjoy footy, but some of you maybe don't like that sport, so I totally get it. I myself had to grow to come to love the game. I would actually say it's probably right up there with hockey for me now, but if you're not, you might be trying to figure out something else. Baseball is fantastic right now. It's great for the game. Well, I'm an Orioles fan, maybe not for you Jays fans. I'm sorry. I know it's been a rough season, but no matter what, whatever your sport you're into, whether it's IndyCar, F1, all this other stuff, FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up any bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode, as we are just we're wrapping up with what initially started out with some fun stuff with the draft, and maybe now we're getting to the not so fun stuff. So Rutger McGroarty is still a Winnipeg Jet, and when asked about it, obviously Cheveldayoff was pretty, I would say, nondescript. He said he is a Jets prospect currently, and that's basically where he'll leave it. So if you hear that, you probably get the sense that things are not great between Winnipeg and McGroarty's camp. And it also just came out not too long ago that he is not going to be at the Jets prospect camp next week. The more I hear that, the more it's starting to really irritate me. I feel like Rutger has kind of forced this issue more than I thought he was going to. I just don't know that I like the way that he's handling this. And I don't necessarily disagree with his concern about getting an NHL spot, but like, man, dude, I just feel like on the one hand, the Jets really should have planned for this better, right? There should have been a way and a mechanism for him to make the NHL a little bit faster out of college. But by the same token, we've had to see a lot of players wait. Kyle Connor spent like 40 or 50 games with the Moose. Heinola has waited a couple of years. And you can definitely say that some of these kids were overcooked, and I think that is absolutely fair. But by the same token, I also feel like there's just a certain level of expectation where I think you're asking for a little more than most teams are willing to provide. Everyone suggests that the way that the Jets do their prospects is different from a lot of other teams, but honestly, I've seen plenty of squads out there overcook their own prospects. I think it's an NHL culture problem, and I do think at some point teams are going to start wising up to that and changing it. I think the Jets have acknowledged this to a point. We've seen Dallas, use Stankoven pretty early out of his draft years. So I think teams are going to start getting more aggressive with it, but I also feel like to some degree the way that Rutger has handled this just hasn't made me thrilled. He's making it actively more difficult to trade him, and like his value right now is probably cratered because of this whole leak. I think the Jets are going to have to wait a while before they can really think about trading him, and it sounds like Montreal and Minnesota were both very close to acquiring him. Didn't end up happening. He seems like a really Minnesota player, if you ask me. Big physical winger with a great shot. You know, they don't have a lot of top end scorers, and McGroarty, I guess, is one of those on ice leaders. But man, the way that he's kind of taken this direction, I do think the Jets have now been scared off from NCAA prospects. I think that's going to be a thing for a while. It's a shame because college has lots of really talented players, but thanks to Winnipeg's own reputation for how they've used their prospects and the fact that college players just exert more control over their destiny, I think it's put Winnipeg in a very tough position, and it's unlikely that we're going to see a resolution anytime soon. I thought, with all the reports that the trade was going to happen, I think Winnipeg was really trying. It sounds like they were on the phone with San Jose when San Jose was on the clock, earlier in the draft. So it's not for a lack of effort, but I think there was probably some understanding that McGroarty is just going to sit out and sit on his hands until a trade happens. So, I mean, it just is what it is at this point, right? I will say that Winnipeg really didn't draft any college kids this time. That's obviously pretty noticeable. Even if Zeev Buim was like available where Winnipeg was able to trade up and get him in the first round, obviously he would have been a huge get for the Jets, but I almost guarantee that they probably weren't going to do it because he plays for Denver. And with how the McGroarty situation has gone, would you really want to do the whole Zeev thing, or with the college being a potential problem in your drafted rights? Probably not. So, look, I'll say this, right? The Jets have gotten lots of good players over the years out of college, and a lot of them have played quite a few games for the Jets. Trouba has. He wanted a trade because, his girlfriend was wanting to do med school, so I respect that a lot. Kyle Connor has played, for the Jets for many, many years, and he was a big college kid. Connor Hellebuck has committed long-term, although it looked briefly like he was about to leave. Kopp, of course, had quite a few seasons with the Jets. Mason has too. So like in terms of like Americans and college kids, the Jets have quite a bit of success with drafting those players. So I don't want to say that the McGroarty thing has really soured it forever for me, but I do think temporarily, as more and more college kids are starting to do this stuff, it does make me think that maybe you're going to have to adjust strategy. And it's something that I've seen from guys on Twitter like Nick Lynham, who has Top Lines podcast. I think he's probably right in that thinking. I think the Jets have probably also signaled that they're going to make that adjustment. And I know everyone's like, oh, just draft Canadians instead. But I don't think it's the nationality that's the concern. I think the biggest issue is whether or not, they're willing to commit long-term. Like we've had some top American players commit to us, and they're the cornerstones of our franchise. So I don't want to like read too much into that specifically, but I do think the college conduit maybe is something that the Jets may look to make lower round picks in rather than, using like a first or a second rounder on a prospect in that range. And that's fine. Like there's tons of great kids out of college, but if there's an opportunity to maybe trade that pick because there's a highly touted college prospect that another team might be able to convince to sign over Winnipeg, then you know what? Maybe you should just leverage that. I think there's ways to make the most of a bit of a crappy situation. And, the McGroarty thing right now looks really bad. And, maybe the Jets sort of missed the bus, but with how the Jets have traditionally handled things, I'm just going to reserve judgment until they actually make the trade. It may take some time and patience, but it's not like Rutger can really go anywhere. He does still have, some rights control that sits with the Jets. And so, Winnipeg's going to be what, they're going to be patient. They're going to do what they need to do to make sure that they get the trade return that they feel is appropriate. The asking price on Ehlers, of course, still remains around a first-round pick of sorts and a prospect or a roster player. I'm going to guess that probably hasn't shifted. And, next year's draft, I think, is supposed to have a reasonably good first round. It's still pretty far out, so projecting aggressively is not really something I like to do, but if the Jets get a 2025 first rounder and something else out of it, it could be of interest, whether it's at the start of this year or towards the trade deadline. But, as in all things, we're just going to have to be patient. For the meantime, I'm just going to enjoy the draft picks the Jets got, in this year's draft, and free agency is about to start. Excited to see how that goes. Hopefully we get some roster resolution with our blue line and maybe some of our depth forwards We will find out as we start getting closer. One thing we did see somebody tweet out was the Sabres potentially being interested in both Ehlers and Iafallo. So we'll see how that goes over the next few weeks. But of course, this coming week, we'll probably have some more Jets coverage and more off-season thoughts, hopefully good ones. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you here this week for even more Jets coverage. So see you then. And as always, have a great night and go Jets go.